Let me tell you something about the nature of pressure, real pressure, the kind that doesn't announce itself with sirens or warning shots. It arrives quietly, like water rising beneath a sealed door, and by the time most people notice it, the room is already half full. That is exactly what is happening right now in the Middle East. And if you are not paying attention, if you are watching the headlines without understanding the architecture beneath them, you are going to miss what may be the most consequential strategic moment of this decade. Stay with me, because what I am about to walk you through is not commentary. It is a mission briefing. And the stakes are not abstract. They are measured in oil, in warheads, in the lives of sailors at sea, and in the security of every nation that depends on the free flow of energy through one of the most critical waterways on Earth. I have spent decades operating in environments where the difference between victory and catastrophe was not firepower. It was clarity. Clarity of mission, clarity of intent, clarity of what the enemy is actually doing versus what they want you to believe they are doing. And right now, Iran is running one of the oldest deception plays in the book. They are projecting strength while bleeding out from the inside. They are puffing out their chest while their currency collapses. Their oil sits landlocked in tanks, and their people are watched over by foreign militias who don't even speak Farsi. A regime that imports armed men from Iraq and Afghanistan to patrol the streets of its own capital is not a regime operating from a position of power. It is a regime fighting for survival. And that distinction matters enormously, because how you respond to a cornered enemy is completely different from how you respond to a dominant one. Let's start with the Strait of Hormuz. If you want to understand this conflict, you have to understand that waterway. Roughly 20% of the world's oil passes through it. It is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. It is, in every strategic sense of the word, the jugular of the global energy system. Iran has known this for decades. They have built their entire deterrence doctrine around the threat of closing it, or at minimum, making it so dangerous that the insurance markets, the shipping companies, and the energy traders do their job for them. You don't have to sink a ship. You just have to make the world believe you might. And for years, that threat was enough. But something has shifted. The American maritime blockade that has been tightening around Iran's ports since mid-April has turned that equation inside out. Iran is producing oil it cannot sell. Tankers are accumulating near Karg Island, for decades the central artery of Iranian oil exports. And this week, reports emerged that tanker movement from that island has nearly stopped. There are signs of oil leaks around the facility. Think about what that means operationally. An oil well is not a faucet you simply turn off. The pressure systems, the infrastructure, the piping, it is extraordinarily complex. Shutting down a well improperly can cause damage that costs billions of dollars and years to repair. Iran is not just losing revenue, it may be destroying its own long-term production capacity in the attempt to hold on. And this is where I want you to think like a strategist, not a spectator. The blockade is not just economic pressure, it is a message. It says, we can strangle you without dropping another bomb. We can make the math of survival so painful that you come back to the table on our terms, not yours. That is discipline, patient, strategic power. And patience, in my experience, is one of the most underestimated weapons in any commander's arsenal. But patience has a limit. And what happens when that limit is reached is something every serious observer of this conflict needs to understand. Because the next phase, what some inside the administration are already calling Operation Heavy Hammer, is not just a change of name. It is a signal. It is a warning order. And in military culture, warning orders are not speculation. They are preparation. Let me tell you about preparation. When I commanded the raid on Abbottabad, we did not walk in hoping for the best. We rehearsed. We mapped. We anticipated failure at every node and built redundancy into every plan. We prepared for the mission that existed, not the one we wished existed. Right now, the United States military is doing exactly that with respect to Iran. The targets being discussed are not random. Energy infrastructure, continued pressure on Karg Island and the Strait, strikes on Revolutionary Guard command and control centers, the disruption of extremist leadership. These are not punitive measures. They are designed to change the survival calculus of a regime, to make the cost of continued defiance exceed the cost of a real concession. That is coercive strategy at its most precise. But here is the part that most analysts are glossing over, and what I am about to tell you reframes everything else you will hear this week. Iran is not negotiating as a unified government. Let me say that again because it matters. Trump is not sitting across the table from one decision maker. He is dealing with a fractured system, a president in Pezeshkian who is trying to project diplomatic reasonableness, a Revolutionary Guard that views any meaningful concession as an existential threat to its own power and budget, an ideological hardline camp that genuinely believes resistance is identity, and a supreme leader in Khamenei who is reportedly wounded, isolated, and possibly being used as a symbolic figurehead while the Guard runs the actual policy. When you are negotiating with a system that is this fragmented, every concession on your side creates a vacuum that the hardliners rush to fill. They do not see compromise as statecraft. They see it as weakness to be exploited, and they will use every day, every hour, every diplomatic delay to move materials, repair infrastructure, and rebuild what was damaged. That is why the sequencing of any agreement is not a technical detail. It is the entire ballgame. Iran's opening position is this: first, remove the sanctions. First, release the frozen funds. First, open the oil routes. First, grant us recognition of our status in the Strait. And then maybe we will talk seriously about uranium and enrichment and missiles and proxies. From a negotiating standpoint, I understand the logic. Every party tries to bank gains before making concessions. But from a security standpoint, that sequence is catastrophic. Because if Iran receives economic and maritime oxygen before it has verifiably dismantled its nuclear capability, it doesn't just get money, it gets time. And in this conflict, time is the most dangerous currency of all. Time to relocate enriched materials, time to repair centrifuge halls, time to pull launchers out of underground storage, time to reopen smuggling routes through Turkey, through the Caspian, through ghost banking networks that move money faster than any sanctions regime can track it. Time to sell the world a photograph of peace while the machinery of war hums quietly underground. I've seen this before, not in Iran specifically, but in the broader pattern of how authoritarian regimes use negotiation as a tactical weapon. They don't negotiate to reach agreement. They negotiate to buy space. They use the theater of diplomacy to reduce pressure, reconstitute capability, and emerge from the process stronger than when they entered it. The lesson of October 7th, the lesson Israel paid for in blood, is that you cannot measure a threat by the quiet it makes today. You measure it by the capability it is building for tomorrow. Hamas can be smiling at a ceasefire table in Doha, while engineers are reinforcing tunnel walls in Khan Yunis. Iran can be sending delegations to Geneva, while centrifuges spin in hardened underground facilities at Fordow. Quiet is not security. It is sometimes just the sound of your enemy reloading. This week made that lesson viscerally clear. American naval vessels, including ships operating in the Gulf, were directly threatened by Iranian actions. Missiles, drones, fast boats from the Revolutionary Guard's naval forces moving aggressively in contested waters. The Americans intercepted those threats and responded with strikes on Revolutionary Guard infrastructure in southern Iran, launch sites, command and control centers, naval facilities near Bandar Abbas and Keshem Island. Washington is still framing this as a measured response, calibrated, proportionate, below the threshold of full re-engagement. And that framing is deliberate. But every military professional watching this understands the subtext. We are one miscalculation away from a very different conversation. If an American ship is hit, if American sailors are killed, the patience in Washington does not just run out, it evaporates. And what replaces it will look nothing like what we have seen so far. Now let's talk about China, because no strategic picture of this moment is complete without understanding what happened when Trump arrived in Beijing. On the surface, it looked like the standard choreography of great power diplomacy: orchestras, handshakes, carefully worded joint statements about cooperation and mutual respect. But underneath that ceremony, there was one issue that dominated the real conversation: Iran. China is Iran's largest oil customer. Beijing depends on the flow of energy from the Gulf to fuel its industrial base, and it cannot afford, economically or politically, for the Strait of Hormuz to remain closed indefinitely. That gives Washington leverage. Not military leverage, diplomatic leverage, the kind that is sometimes more powerful than any bomb. If Trump can convince Xi Jinping that China's long-term energy security is better protected by pressuring Tehran to make real concessions than by shielding Iran behind quiet diplomatic cover, the entire dynamic of these negotiations shifts. China becomes a co-guarantor of a deal rather than a spoiler of American pressure. That is a significant strategic prize, and it is one Trump appears to be pursuing deliberately. But here is the danger in that calculation, and what comes next will challenge everything you think you know about how great power relationships actually function in a crisis. China's interests are not aligned with America's. They are parallel at best and divergent at worst. Beijing does not want a nuclear-armed Iran that is completely outside American deterrence. That creates unpredictability that threatens the energy flows China depends on. But Beijing also does not want a weakened Iran that has been fully brought to heel by Washington, because a compliant Iran means a more dominant America in a region China views as a future sphere of influence. So China will play both sides. It will appear helpful in the room while ensuring that the pressure on Tehran never becomes quite decisive enough to produce a full capitulation. That is not duplicity for its own sake. That is strategy. And understanding it means understanding that America cannot outsource the heavy lifting of this confrontation to Beijing. The pressure must be American, the credibility must be American, and if the military option returns to the table, that decision will be made in Washington, not in any conversation with Xi. Meanwhile, in Lebanon, Israel is making something absolutely clear. Diplomatic conversations do not equal operational immunity, not for Hezbollah, not for any of Iran's proxies. This week, during some of the most sensitive diplomatic back and forth of this entire period, the IDF struck in the Dahieh neighborhood of Beirut and eliminated a commander in the Radwan forces, the elite unit that Hezbollah has spent years building specifically to threaten Israel's northern communities and the Galilee. Think about the message embedded in that strike. It says, "We see you, we know what you are building, and we will not wait until you are ready." That is not aggression. That is preemption rooted in hard intelligence and harder lessons. The communities of northern Israel, the families who were evacuated, the children who have grown up within range of Hezbollah's anti-tank cells and rocket launchers, they did not get a warning on October 7th. Israel has decided, as a matter of strategic doctrine, that it will never again wait for the first move. In southern Lebanon, the picture being painted by Israeli operations is not one of retaliation. It is one of systematic dismantlement. Military buildings, weapons depots, rocket launchers, underground infrastructure. And this week came a detail that should stop every person who still believes in the fiction of clean separation between civilian life and terrorist infrastructure. Weapons caches and tunnel networks found beneath a children's clothing store. Let that settle for a moment. Not a military base, not a government facility, a children's clothing store. That is not coincidence. That is method. That is doctrine. The deliberate embedding of military capability inside civilian space, because the calculation is simple and ruthless. Either the enemy does not strike and the weapons remain, or the enemy strikes and the images of destruction become a propaganda weapon more powerful than any missile. Israel has decided it will no longer accept that equation. And frankly, any nation serious about its own survival would make the same decision. You do not win against an enemy that hides behind children by refusing to act. You win by being so precise, so intelligence-driven, and so relentless in your targeting that the strategy of human shielding stops providing the protection it once did. Lebanon itself is beginning to fracture under the weight of what Iran has done to it. This week brought something genuinely unprecedented. A Lebanese complaint filed at the United Nations Security Council against Iran and against Hezbollah, asserting that Tehran is actively undermining Lebanese sovereignty and dragging the country into a war that the Lebanese people never chose and never voted for. Read that carefully. Lebanon, the country that has hosted Hezbollah for decades, that has looked the other way as Iran built a state within a state on its soil, that has allowed its southern territory to become a forward operating base for the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, that Lebanon is now raising its voice at the highest international forum and saying, Iran is harming us. That is not a small thing. That is a crack in the foundation of the entire Iranian proxy model in the Levant. And cracks, in my experience, have a way of becoming fissures, and fissures have a way of becoming collapse, if the right pressure is applied at the right moment. But here's what I need you to understand about the gap that still exists between Lebanon wanting quiet and Israel requiring security. Quiet and security are not the same thing. They never have been. A ceasefire that leaves Hezbollah's tunnel network intact, its missile arsenal concealed, its financial pipelines flowing from Tehran, and its command structure reorganizing in Beirut's southern suburbs. That ceasefire is not peace. It is a pause. It is a reload. It is the same mistake made in 2006, dressed up in new diplomatic language, and sold to a world that desperately wants to believe the fighting is over. Israel cannot afford to buy that illusion, and any framework coming out of Washington that does not include the verifiable dismantlement of Hezbollah's military capability is not a solution. It is a delay with a very predictable ending. I have planned enough operations to know that the enemy always exploits the pause you give them. Always, without exception. Now turn your attention to Gaza, because while the world's cameras have swung north toward Beirut and east toward Tehran and the Strait of Hormuz, something critically important is happening in the rubble of what was once Hamas's domain. Hamas has informed American mediators that it will not disarm. Full stop. No conditions. No negotiating position wrapped around it. A flat refusal. From Israel's perspective, and from mine, that is not a setback in a negotiation. That is an answer. It is the answer to the only question that actually matters. Does Hamas intend to govern, or does it intend to reconstitute and fight? And the answer they have given, with complete clarity, is that they intend to reconstitute and fight. Everything else, the humanitarian posturing, the prisoner exchange discussions, the temporary ceasefires, is subordinate to that core strategic intent. And what comes next in Gaza will challenge every assumption the international community has made about what post-conflict reconstruction looks like. Because Hamas is not waiting for permission to rebuild its military capability. Reports this week describe smuggling operations by air, by sea, and by land. The exploitation of humanitarian aid shipments as cover for weapons components. The active suppression of any alternative governing body that might challenge Hamas's control. The distribution of money to operatives to maintain loyalty and organizational coherence. The elimination this week of Azzam al-Hayya, the son of senior Hamas figure Khalil al-Hayya, fits precisely into this picture. He was not the headline target of the strike, but he was a nerve channel. In any terrorist organization, the liaison between the political leadership and the military wing is not a bureaucratic function. It is the circulatory system of operational command. Sever it, and the organization's ability to translate political decisions into military action degrades. That is targeting with strategic purpose, not targeting for optics. Meanwhile, in Rafah and along the Gaza border, Israel is demonstrating the opposite of a declaration. It is demonstrating engineering. clearing territory, destroying above-ground and below-ground infrastructure with methodical precision, restoring security to the communities that sit along the fence, communities that woke up on October 7th to the sound of the perimeter failing. This is the work that does not generate headlines. It does not produce dramatic footage. It is slow, dangerous, unglamorous, and absolutely essential. A tunnel does not disappear because a document was signed. A rocket launcher does not stop functioning because a spokesperson in Doha announced a humanitarian pause. A terrorist organization does not disarm because someone in a Western capital needs to believe the crisis is over. Security is not built on belief. It is built on cleared ground, demolished infrastructure, and the permanent removal of the capability to harm, meter by meter. That is how it is done. That is how it has always been done. Let me turn now to the Houthis and the broader architecture of Iranian proxy warfare, because one of the most dangerous misconceptions in current analysis is the idea that these are separate conflicts. Lebanon is not separate. Gaza is not separate. Yemen is not separate. The militias in Iraq are not separate. They are nodes in a single network, funded by a single source, directed by a single strategic vision emanating from Tehran, or more precisely, from the Revolutionary Guard's Quds Force, which has operated as Iran's external action arm for decades. When the Houthis fire missiles at commercial shipping in the Red Sea, they are not acting independently. They are executing a coordinated pressure strategy designed to demonstrate that Iran's reach extends far beyond its borders. That closing the Strait of Hormuz is only one option in a menu of economic disruption that stretches from the Gulf of Aden to the Mediterranean. When Iraqi militias fire rockets at American positions, they are not freelancing. They are signaling. They are keeping American attention divided and American resources stretched. That is the Iranian model. Distribute the threat, disperse the response. Make your enemy fight on 5 fronts simultaneously while you negotiate on one. And if you think the maritime dimension of this conflict ends at Hormuz, you are not seeing the full battlefield. This week, the Caspian Sea reemerged as a critical variable. While global attention is fixed on the southern choke point, Iran and Russia have been quietly using the northern route through the Caspian to move food, equipment, and potentially components for drone manufacturing and other military systems. When everyone is watching the front door, the back door becomes the most important door in the building. That is why Israeli strikes against naval capabilities in northern Iran carry strategic weight that goes far beyond their immediate tactical effect. If Iran can bypass the southern blockade through the Caspian corridor, the pressure on Hormuz weakens, the economic stranglehold loosens, and the entire coercive strategy that has been built over weeks of patient, disciplined maritime pressure begins to leak. Plugging that leak is not optional. It is essential to the integrity of the entire campaign. Now I want to speak directly to the question that every serious observer is asking. Is the next military strike against Iran coming? Based on everything visible this week, the trajectory of the negotiations, the continued Iranian threats against American naval vessels, the hardline positioning of the Revolutionary Guard, the reports of internal regime fragmentation, and the quiet discussions inside the American administration about Operation Heavy Hammer, the answer is that the military option is closer than it was 7 days ago. But closer is not certain, and the timing of any decision will hinge on 3 variables. First, what Trump returns with from his engagement with China. If Beijing delivers meaningful pressure on Tehran, real pressure, not performative diplomatic language, the path to a negotiated resolution remains viable, though narrow. Second, whether Iran continues to insist on sequencing that would give it economic relief before making verifiable concessions on its nuclear program. Every day that Iran holds that position is a day the military option gains credibility as the only remaining lever. And third, whether there is another maritime or military event, another threat against an American ship, another missile fired at a naval vessel, another action that crosses a threshold Washington has privately defined but not yet publicly articulated. That third variable is the one that keeps commanders awake at night, because you cannot always control when a threshold gets crossed. Sometimes the enemy makes that decision for you. This is the moment where I want you to think beyond the immediate. Think about what a successful outcome actually looks like, and more importantly, what a failed outcome looks like dressed up as success. Any agreement with Iran must be measured against a very specific checklist, not a vague framework, not a joint statement full of diplomatic language designed to let both sides claim victory. A checklist. Does the enriched uranium physically leave Iranian territory? Does enrichment stop, not pause, not slow, but stop for a defined, verifiable period? Are the central nuclear facilities, Fordow, Natanz, Isfahan, dismantled or credibly neutralized, not merely frozen? Do the ballistic missiles fall within the scope of the agreement, or are they conveniently excluded as a sovereign military matter? Does the money stop flowing to Hezbollah, to Hamas, to the Houthis, to the militias in Iraq? Is Israel's freedom of military action in Lebanon and Gaza explicitly preserved? Is there a real inspection regime, surprise inspections, anywhere, anytime, by international monitors with actual authority? If the answer to any of those questions is unclear, or negotiable, or subject to future discussion, then what has been produced is not a solution. It is a lifeline. It is oxygen for a regime that has proven repeatedly that it uses oxygen to reload. The greatest lesson of the last 20 years of American engagement in the Middle East is not about firepower. It is not about tactics or technology or the particular configurations of strike packages. It is about clarity of purpose. The missions that succeeded, and I have been part of missions that succeeded and missions that fell short, succeeded because everyone involved understood not just what the objective was, but what the objective was for, what it was supposed to produce, what conditions would confirm that the mission had been accomplished. The missions that fell short often had military success and strategic ambiguity in the same package. Targets destroyed, capability temporarily degraded, and then 18 months later, the same problem in a slightly different form. Iran is that problem writ large across decades. And this moment, this precise, volatile, high-stakes moment, is the opportunity to break that cycle. Not by being reckless, not by escalating without purpose, but by being absolutely clear about what a real solution requires and refusing to accept anything less than that standard, regardless of the diplomatic pressure, regardless of the international optics, regardless of the voices that will always counsel patience in the face of a threat they do not have to live with. The Iranian people are not the enemy. I want to be clear about that. The men and women of Iran, the engineers, the teachers, the doctors, the students who have watched their currency collapse and their futures narrow, they did not choose this. They did not vote for the Revolutionary Guard's adventurism. They did not ask to have foreign militias patrolling the streets of Tehran. They are living under a regime that suppresses them with one hand while exporting violence with the other. And in the long arc of this conflict, their voice matters. Their exhaustion matters. Their hunger for normalcy and dignity and economic stability matters enormously. Because ultimately, no external military pressure, however precise and however sustained, produces lasting change without an internal counterpart. The regime that is currently executing its own citizens to maintain control is not a regime that has made peace with its future. It is a regime in a rearguard action against its own people. And that is a vulnerability that strategic patience, combined with unyielding external pressure, can ultimately exploit. And never confuse the map with the terrain.